He thought breaking her would be easy, but in less than 10 seconds, Evelyn Brooks would turn his entire reputation into silence. The late afternoon light poured through the tall glass windows of Iron Forge Gym, casting long reflections across the polished mats where seasoned fighters trained with controlled intensity, the air thick with the scent of effort and quiet competition. And in the middle of it all stood Ryan Cole, a 6'2" black belt known not just for his skill, but for the way he carried authority like it was something earned and owned, his voice sharp, his presence commanding, the kind of man people stepped aside for without being told. So when the front door opened, and a woman in her early 40s stepped in wearing a plain gray hoodie, worn sneakers, and no sign of belonging in a place like this, it didn't take long for the shift to begin. The subtle glances, the quick smirks, the silent assumptions forming before she even reached the front desk. Evelyn Brooks moved quietly, her posture relaxed, her gaze steady but unassuming, like someone who had no interest in being noticed. And maybe that was the first mistake they all made, because in a room built on dominance, quietness looked like weakness. "You lost?" One of the younger trainees muttered under his breath, earning a chuckle from the others, and Ryan noticed immediately, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he stepped closer, measuring her the way he measured everyone, with a glance that judged, categorized, and dismissed all at once. "This isn't a beginner class," he said, his tone calm, but edged with condescension, the kind that didn't need to be loud to land. "You sure you're in the right place?" Evelyn paused for just a second, her hand resting lightly on the strap of her bag, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded once, simple, polite. "I called earlier," she said softly. "They said walk-ins were fine." And for a moment, there was a flicker of something in Ryan's eyes, not respect, not curiosity, but something closer to irritation, like she had just stepped outside the role he had already assigned her. Behind him, a few trainees shifted, watching now, sensing the tension build. In small, almost invisible layers, because this wasn't just about a new person walking in. This was about control, about hierarchy, about who belonged and who didn't. Ryan let out a short breath, glancing around as if to include the room in the moment. "All right," he said, louder this time. "But just so we're clear, we take this seriously here." A few nods followed, a few smirks, the atmosphere tightening just enough to feel it in the chest. "People train for years to get to this level," he added, his eyes returning to Evelyn, lingering just long enough to make the message clear without saying it outright. Evelyn didn't respond, not with words, not with attitude. She simply stepped forward, setting her bag down carefully against the wall, her movements calm, deliberate, almost too calm for someone being quietly challenged in front of a room full of strangers. And that was when the first real shift happened, subtle, but there, because confidence that didn't need to announce itself had a way of unsettling people who relied on noise. One of the trainees leaned in, whispering just loud enough, "This should be interesting." And Ryan smiled, just slightly, the kind of smile that came before a lesson, before a demonstration, before someone was put in their place. "Let's see what you've got," he said, gesturing toward the mat, casual on the surface, but unmistakably a setup, and around them. The room began to quiet, conversations fading, movements slowing, eyes turning, because everyone knew what was about to happen, or at least, they thought they did. Evelyn stepped onto the mat without hesitation, her shoes left neatly at the edge, her feet landing softly against the surface as if she had done it 1,000 times before, though no one noticed that detail yet. Not really, because they were too focused on what they expected to see, not what was actually there. Ryan rolled his shoulders, loosening up, confident, controlled, already certain of the outcome before anything had even begun, and somewhere in the silence that followed, something unspoken settled over the room, the kind of quiet that comes right before everything changes, though no one realized it yet. Not even Ryan, not even the ones watching closest, because sometimes the biggest mistakes aren't loud, they're made in the certainty that nothing unexpected is about to happen. Ryan stepped onto the mat with the relaxed confidence of someone who had never needed to question his place, his bare feet pressing firmly against the surface as he gestured for Evelyn to move closer, the faint squeak of rubber soles and distant clinks of training equipment fading into the background as the rest of the gym subtly reoriented around them. A semicircle began to form, not officially, not announced, but naturally, like gravity pulling attention towards something that promised entertainment. And in that circle stood Evelyn Brooks, quiet, composed, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her breathing steady in a way that did not match the tension building around her. "We will keep it light," Ryan said, though the tone beneath his words suggested something else entirely, something performative, something designed for the audience now watching with growing interest. Just basic movement, nothing complicated. A few of the trainees exchanged knowing glances, the kind that came from having seen this before. Someone stepping in, someone getting tested, someone leaving with a lesson they would not forget. One of the younger men leaned against the wall, arms crossed, whispering to the person beside him. "This is going to be over fast," and a quiet ripple of agreement moved through the group. Not loud enough to interrupt, but clear enough to define the expectation hanging in the air. Evelyn took one small step forward, her feet settling naturally into position. Not exaggerated, not showy, just precise in a way that most people would not notice unless they were looking for it. And that was the difference, because Ryan was not looking for it. He was looking at her hoodie, her age, her calm silence. All the external details that made her easy to categorize. "Have you trained before?" he asked, almost as an afterthought, his voice carrying just enough volume for the others to hear. As if the answer itself was part of the setup, Evelyn's eyes met his for a brief moment, steady, unshaken, a little. She replied, and the simplicity of that answer drew a faint smirk from someone in the back, the kind that said they had already decided what that meant. Ryan nodded slowly, rolling his neck once, then loosening his shoulders again, the movement deliberate, almost theatrical now, because the audience had grown, and with it, the need to maintain control, to reinforce hierarchy, to remind everyone watching why he stood where he did in this room. "All right then," he said, stepping closer, his stance widening slightly, not aggressive, but unmistakably dominant. "Let us see how you move." And for a moment, the entire gym seemed to hold its breath, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, scattered pauses that added up to something heavier, something charged. Evelyn did not rush. She did not react with nervous energy or forced confidence. She simply adjusted her footing, her weight shifting almost imperceptibly, her posture aligning in a way that felt natural rather than practiced. And that quiet precision created the first crack in the expectation forming around her, though no one spoke it aloud. Ryan made the first move, not sudden, not fast, but intentional, closing the distance in a way meant to guide, to control the rhythm, to establish the pace of the exchange before it even began. And as he did, his expression carried the certainty of someone who had done this countless times, someone who believed this moment was already decided. But Evelyn did something unexpected. Not dramatic, not flashy, just a subtle shift, a small adjustment of angle that placed her just outside the line he anticipated, her movement so minimal it almost went unnoticed, yet precise enough to disrupt the flow he had already imagined. And for the briefest second, Ryan hesitated, not enough for anyone else to register, but enough for something deeper to stir beneath his confidence. A few of the trainees leaned in slightly, their attention sharpening without them realizing why, because the energy had changed, just a fraction, just enough to make the outcome feel less certain than it had a moment ago. "Relax," Ryan said, more to himself than to her, resetting his stance, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as he prepared to continue. Because whatever that small moment had been, he was not about to let it define the narrative he had already created. Evelyn remained still, her eyes calm, her presence grounded in a way that did not match the role they had all assigned to her. And in that stillness, something unspoken grew, something that had nothing to do with strength or speed, but everything to do with control, the kind that did not need to be announced to be real. And as the room watched, waiting for the obvious to unfold, they did not yet realize they were witnessing the quiet beginning of something they would not be able to explain once it was over. Ryan moved again, this time with more intention, his steps measured but firmer, as if correcting a rhythm that had briefly slipped from his control, and the faint sound of his foot brushing the mat echoed louder than it should have in the growing silence. The circle of onlookers tightened without anyone stepping forward, their attention no longer casual but focused, drawn in by something they could not yet name. Because what had started as entertainment was beginning to feel like a test with an outcome that was no longer predictable. Evelyn remained exactly where she was, her shoulders relaxed, her hands loose, her gaze steady in a way that did not challenge but did not retreat either. And that balance unsettled Ryan more than any obvious resistance could have, because there was nothing to push against, nothing to dominate, nothing to prove himself over in the way he expected. "You are holding back," he said, his voice sharper now, carrying a note that had not been there before. Something closer to irritation than instruction, and a few of the trainees exchanged glances, sensing the shift even if they did not fully understand it. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the words without reacting to them. "I am listening," she replied quietly, and the simplicity of that answer landed differently this time, not as weakness, but as something harder to define, something that made the air feel heavier. Ryan exhaled slowly, resetting again, but this time, there was a subtle tightness in his jaw, a flicker of something beneath the confidence he had carried so easily moments before, because control that had to be reasserted was no longer absolute. He stepped in once more, closing the distance with a controlled motion, his posture still dominant, his presence still strong, but now there was a trace of urgency beneath it, a need to re-establish the narrative in front of the audience that was watching more closely than before. Evelyn shifted again, a fraction of a step, her movement almost invisible unless someone was looking directly at her feet. And that was where the difference lay, because she was not reacting to him. She was positioning herself ahead of him, adjusting to something he had not yet done, and that kind of anticipation did not come from guessing. It came from knowing. One of the older trainees, a man who had been silent until now, leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowing as he watched, something in Evelyn's posture triggering a recognition he could not quite place. And he did not laugh like the others had earlier. He did not smirk. He simply watched. Ryan paused again, just for a second, and this time it was visible, a small break in the flow that the room could feel even if they did not consciously register it. And the energy shifted once more, not dramatically, but enough to quiet the last remaining whispers. "Focus," he said, more firmly now, as if speaking to both of them, but the word hung in the air with a different weight, because it was no longer just instruction, it was a command to himself as much as to her. Evelyn's breathing remained steady, her chest rising and falling in a calm rhythm that did not match the tension building around her. And in that calm, there was something unshakable, something that did not bend under pressure because it was not defined by it in the first place. Ryan made another attempt to guide the movement, stepping in with more clarity, more direction, but Evelyn adjusted again, seamlessly, her body aligning with a precision that now began to stand out, not as luck, not as coincidence, but as something deliberate, something practiced, something real. The man watching from the side straightened slightly, his eyes narrowing as the pieces began to connect in his mind, because he had seen that kind of control before, not often, not in places like this, but enough to recognize that what was happening on the mat was not what it appeared to be. Around them, the room had gone quiet in a way that felt different from before, not expectant, not amused, but attentive. The kind of silence that comes when people realize they might have misread a situation from the very beginning. And in the center of it all stood Evelyn Brooks, still calm, still quiet, but no longer invisible, because something about her could no longer be ignored. And as Ryan prepared to move again, there was a growing sense, subtle but undeniable, that the moment everyone had been waiting for was not going to unfold the way they had imagined. Ryan stepped forward again, but this time there was no trace of casual confidence in the movement, only intention sharpened by something he did not fully understand yet. And the moment his foot settled against the mat, the air in the room seemed to tighten, as if everyone present sensed that whatever came next would define more than just a simple demonstration. Evelyn did not move immediately. She did not rush to meet him or retreat from him. She simply waited, her eyes steady, her breathing even, her entire presence grounded in a way that felt almost immovable. And for the first time since she had walked through the door, Ryan hesitated in a way that could not be hidden, not completely, not from the ones who were now watching with sharpened attention. "You keep adjusting before I do," he said, his voice lower now, less performative, more direct. as if he was no longer speaking for the room, but for himself, trying to understand something that did not fit into the patterns he relied on. And Evelyn's response was as simple as before. "I am not adjusting to you," she said quietly. "I am already where I need to be." And that sentence landed differently than anything else she had said, not because it was louder or stronger, but because it carried a certainty that did not need to be proven. A faint murmur rippled through the group, quickly fading. As people caught themselves, because the shift was undeniable now, the dynamic had changed, and even those who had been laughing earlier no longer felt comfortable doing so. Ryan drew in a slow breath, resetting his stance once more, but this time there was no show in it, no performance for the audience, just focus, concentrated and deliberate, because whatever assumption he had made about Evelyn Brooks had already begun to unravel. He stepped in again, closing the distance with more clarity than before, his posture controlled, his movement precise, and for a brief moment, it seemed like he had found his rhythm again, like he had re-established the flow that defined him, and several of the trainees leaned forward slightly, expecting the moment to resolve the way it always did. But Evelyn moved, not quickly, not dramatically, just a small shift, a turn of her shoulders, a change in angle that redirected the space between them without force, without tension, and in that instant, Ryan's movement lost its alignment, not in a way that anyone could call out, not in a way that looked obvious, but enough that the continuity of his motion broke, and he had to stop, just for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the interruption to register. The man who had been watching closely straightened fully now, his arms uncrossing, his expression no longer neutral, because he recognized it clearly this time. The control, the timing, the understanding of distance that came from years, not weeks, not months, but years of experience, and he was not the only one beginning to see it. The room had grown so quiet that the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed louder than before, and every eye was fixed on the two figures at the center of the mat, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of realization, the slow, creeping awareness that they had misjudged something fundamental from the very beginning. Ryan stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but recalibrating his gaze, fixed on Evelyn now with a level of attention that had not been there before, because he was no longer looking at her as an outsider. He was looking at her as a variable he could not predict. "Where did you train?" he asked, the question coming out before he could stop it. And for a moment, it felt out of place in the tension that had built, but it carried something important, something human, the first crack in the certainty that had defined him. Evelyn did not answer right away. She simply held his gaze, her expression calm, unreadable, and in that silence, the weight of the question grew heavier, because it was no longer casual curiosity. It was recognition trying to catch up with reality. Around them, no one spoke, no one shifted, because they all felt it now, the moment where everything they had assumed was being quietly rewritten, not with noise, not with force, but with precision, with control, with something that could not be faked or borrowed. And as Ryan stood there, waiting for an answer he was no longer sure he wanted, the truth was already unfolding in front of him, not in words, but in the undeniable fact that the woman he had tried to test was not there to be measured at all, and whatever came next was not going to be a lesson for her. It was going to be one for him. Ryan did not repeat the question, but it lingered between them, heavier than anything that had been said before, because now it was no longer about control or performance. It was about understanding something that refused to fit into the narrow space he had created for it. Evelyn finally moved, but not in the way the room expected, not forward, not defensive, just a subtle shift of her weight as she straightened slightly, her shoulders aligning with a quiet precision that seemed almost effortless. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, unhurried. "Different places," she said, and though the answer revealed nothing specific, it carried a depth that made further questions feel unnecessary. Ryan studied her for a moment longer, his gaze no longer dismissive, no longer casual, but searching, recalibrating, and for the first time, there was something like restraint in him, a recognition that whatever he had assumed was no longer reliable. "Again," he said finally, but the tone had changed, stripped of its earlier edge, replaced with something more measured, more careful, and the room felt it. Immediately, the subtle shift from demonstration to something closer to respect, though no one spoke it aloud. Evelyn nodded once, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, and as they reset, the silence deepened, not tense, not awkward, but focused, the kind of silence that comes when people realize they are witnessing something real. Ryan stepped in once more, but this time there was no rush, no attempt to impose a rhythm, only attention, his movements deliberate, his awareness sharpened, and, for a brief moment, the balance between them held, equal, controlled, almost still. Then it happened, not suddenly, not violently, but with a clarity that cut through the room like a shift in light. Evelyn moved, a single, fluid adjustment that redirected the space between them with such precision that Ryan found himself out of alignment before he could correct it, his posture forced to reset, his footing adjusting in a way that revealed the gap between expectation and reality. And though there was no force behind it, no aggression, the effect was undeniable. A collective stillness fell over the room, deeper than before, as the realization settled in, not as a shock, but as a quiet truth that could no longer be ignored. Ryan stepped back, not out of retreat, but out of recognition, his breath steady but slower now, his eyes fixed on Evelyn with a clarity that had replaced assumption entirely. And for a moment, neither of them moved, the space between them no longer defined by dominance, but by understanding. One of the trainees shifted slightly, as if to speak, but stopped himself, because there was nothing to add, nothing that could match what had just been shown without words. The older man at the edge of the circle exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, his head tilting just enough to confirm what he already knew. And though he said nothing, his expression carried something rare in that room, acknowledgement. Ryan lowered his stance slightly, not as a display, but as a quiet adjustment, an unspoken admission that he was no longer leading this exchange. And when he spoke again, his voice was different, steadier, stripped of the certainty it once held. You were not here to learn, were you? It was not an accusation, not even a question, just a statement forming as he caught up to what had been unfolding in front of him from the very beginning. Evelyn met his gaze, her expression unchanged, calm, grounded. I came to see, she said softly, and there was no arrogance in it, no challenge, just truth, simple and complete. The words settled into the silence, and in that moment, the entire room understood something they had missed before, that this had never been about proving strength or skill. It had been about perception, about the ease with which they had all decided who belonged and who did not, and how quickly that certainty could be undone. Ryan straightened slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing, not because the moment had passed, but because it had transformed, and as he stepped back, giving space where before he had taken it, the shift was complete, not announced, not celebrated, but felt by everyone present. Evelyn adjusted her sleeve once more, the same small gesture as before, her movements as quiet as her presence. And as she turned slightly, preparing to step off the mat, there was a pause, a collective hesitation in the room, as if no one was ready for the moment to end, because what they had just witnessed was not something that fit into the patterns they were used to. And in that pause, in that silence, the lesson settled deeper than any words could have carried, leaving behind a stillness that said more than anything spoken aloud. No one moved when Evelyn stepped toward the edge of the mat, not because they were waiting for permission, but because something in the room had shifted beyond routine, beyond hierarchy, into a space where instinct told them not to interrupt. The faint hum of the overhead lights returned, subtle but noticeable now that the tension had eased, and yet no one spoke, not even the ones who had laughed earlier, because whatever they had expected to happen had been replaced by something they did not quite know how to process. Ryan remained where he was for a moment, his posture no longer rigid, no longer asserting control, but thoughtful, as if replaying every second that had just unfolded, searching for the exact point where his certainty had started to unravel. Wait, he said finally, the word coming out quieter than before, not a command, not a demand, just a request that carried weight precisely because it was not forced. Evelyn paused, her hand resting lightly against the strap of her bag, her back still turned halfway toward him, and for a brief second, the room held its breath again, not with tension this time, but with anticipation. She turned slightly, meeting his gaze. Once more, her expression unchanged, calm, grounded, as if nothing about the moment required explanation. Ryan stepped closer, but slower now, measured, careful, the distance between them no longer something he closed with confidence, but something he respected. "You said you came to see," he continued, his voice steady but searching. "What exactly were you looking for?" And the question hung there, not just for her, but for everyone listening, because in that moment, it felt like more than curiosity. It felt like an attempt to understand something deeper than technique or skill. Evelyn considered the question, not with hesitation, but with intention, her eyes moving briefly across the room, taking in the faces that had shifted from amusement to quiet attention. And when she spoke, her voice was soft, but it carried clearly. "I was looking for how people treat what they do not understand," she said. And the words landed heavier than anything that had come before, not sharp, not accusatory, but undeniable in their truth. A subtle ripple moved through the group, not sound, not movement, just awareness settling into place, because they all knew, without needing to say it, that they had been part of that answer. Ryan did not respond immediately, his gaze lowering for a brief moment before returning to her, and in that pause, there was no defensiveness, no attempt to reclaim authority, only recognition. The kind that comes when a lesson is learned not through instruction, but through experience. "And what did you find?" he asked quietly, the question no longer about her, but about himself, about the room, about everything that had unfolded since she walked through the door. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment longer, her expression steady. Then she gave the slightest nod, not of approval, not of judgment, but of acknowledgement. "Enough," she replied, and the simplicity of that word carried more meaning than any explanation could have. Silence followed, deeper than before, not uncomfortable, not tense, but reflective. The kind of silence that lingers after something important has been understood. Ryan exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing in a way that had nothing to do with fatigue and everything to do with acceptance. And as he stepped back, giving her the space he had once taken without question, the shift was complete. Evelyn turned again, this time without pause, walking toward the edge of the mat with the same quiet presence she had carried from the beginning, her movements unhurried, unbothered, as if the entire moment had been exactly what she expected it to be. No one stopped her. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to challenge, nothing left to prove, only the weight of what had just been revealed settling into the room. As she reached for her bag and slipped the strap over her shoulder, the faint sound of movement returned around her, subtle, restrained, as if the gym itself was slowly returning to normal, though something fundamental had changed. And as the door opened and she stepped out into the fading light of the evening, the room behind her remained quiet for just a moment longer, because sometimes the most powerful lessons do not arrive with force or noise, they arrive in stillness, leaving behind a silence that says everything words cannot. The door closed softly behind Evelyn, and for a long moment, no one inside Iron Forge Gym moved, as if the air itself needed time to catch up with what had just happened. The usual rhythm of training did not return immediately, the sounds of gloves hitting pads and shoes shifting across the mat replaced by a quiet stillness that felt unfamiliar in a place built on motion and control. Ryan stood where she had left him, his gaze fixed on the empty space near the entrance, his mind replaying every detail with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore the subtle shifts, the calm precision, the way she had never once needed to prove anything, and yet had changed everything. One of the younger trainees cleared his throat softly, as if testing whether it was acceptable to speak again, but the words never came, because whatever they had witnessed did not fit into the usual conversations that followed a training session. The older man who had been watching closely stepped forward at last, his steps measured, his expression thoughtful rather than impressed, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of experience rather than surprise. "You felt it, did you not?" he said, not as a question, but as a statement directed at Ryan. Ryan nodded slowly, his jaw tightening slightly as he exhaled. "She was not reacting," he said, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it during training. "She was already there before I moved." And the words settled into the room with a clarity that made several others shift uncomfortably, because it confirmed what they had begun to suspect but had not yet put into words. The older man gave a small nod, his eyes narrowing slightly as if aligning what he had seen with something from his past. "That is not something you pick up in a few classes," he said. "That is years, maybe decades." And a murmur moved through the group, not loud, not dismissive, but uncertain, because it challenged the assumptions they had made so easily just minutes before. One of the trainees spoke up this time, his voice hesitant. "Then, why would someone like that walk in here like that?" He gestured vaguely toward the door, toward the simplicity of her appearance, the quiet way she had carried herself, as if still trying to reconcile the contrast between what they saw and what they experienced. Ryan did not answer immediately, because the question was not as simple as it sounded, and the longer he stood there, the more he realized that the answer had been in front of him from the beginning, hidden in the very thing they had all overlooked. "Because she did not need us to know," he said finally, his voice steady, but stripped of the certainty it once held, and that realization settled deeper than anything else, because it shifted the focus away from her and back onto them, onto the way they had judged, the way they had assumed, the way they had decided who belonged before understanding who they were looking at. The room remained quiet again, but this time it was different, not heavy, not tense, but reflective, the kind of silence that follows a lesson that cannot be undone once learned. Across the mat, one of the younger trainees looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers slightly as if seeing them differently now, as if questioning something he had taken for granted, and nearby, another adjusted his stance without thinking, his posture shifting in small ways that mirrored what he had seen, though he did not yet realize it. Ryan stepped forward slowly, returning to the center of the mat, but the way he stood was different now, less rigid, less performative, his presence grounded in something quieter, something more aware. And when he looked around at the group, there was no trace of the earlier smirk, no hint of superiority, only a calm recognition that what had happened was not about losing or winning. It was about understanding something deeper than either. "Back to training," he said, but the words carried a different tone now, not an order, not a command, but an invitation to return with a new perspective. And as the group slowly began to move again, the sounds of the gym returning piece by piece, there was a noticeable shift in the way they carried themselves, subtle but real. Yet even as the rhythm resumed, something remained, a quiet awareness that lingered beneath every movement, every glance, every adjustment, because once a moment like that happens, it does not disappear, it settles into the foundation of how things are seen. And outside, beyond the glass doors, Evelyn Brooks walked down the sidewalk without looking back, her steps steady, her presence as quiet as it had been when she arrived, leaving behind a room full of people who would not forget what they had just witnessed, even if they could not fully explain it. Because sometimes the most powerful impact is not the one that announces itself, but the one that stays with you long after the moment has passed. The rhythm of the gym returned, but it was no longer the same rhythm. Something quieter had settled beneath every movement, like a layer of awareness that refused to fade. And even as gloves met pads and feet shifted across the mat, there was a noticeable hesitation in the way people carried themselves, a subtle restraint that had not existed before. Ryan moved through the space with a different presence now, no longer the center of attention, but part of the flow, observing more than directing. His eyes catching details he would have ignored just an hour earlier. The angle of a stance, the timing of a step, the intention behind a movement rather than the surface of it. One of the trainees attempted a familiar combination, something he had practiced countless times, but this time it fell off, not because the technique had changed, but because his awareness had, and he paused, glancing down at his feet as if seeing them for the first time, adjusting slightly, then trying again with a level of focus that had not been there before. Across the room, the older man continued to watch, his arms now relaxed at his sides, his expression calm but thoughtful, and when Ryan approached him, there was no need for introduction, no need for explanation, only a shared understanding that passed between them without words. "You have seen that before," Ryan said quietly, not as a question, but as a recognition. And the man nodded once, his gaze steady. "Not often," he replied, "but enough to know what it looks like when someone does not need to prove anything." And the simplicity of that statement carried a weight that lingered longer than expected. Ryan exhaled slowly, his eyes drifting briefly toward the door where Evelyn had disappeared. as if trying to piece together something that could not be fully explained. She controlled everything without force, he said, more to himself than to the man beside him, like she was not responding to me, but to something deeper. And the man gave a faint nod. That is because she was not fighting you, he said. She was understanding you. And that difference settled into Ryan's mind with a clarity that shifted something fundamental inside him. Nearby, a few of the younger trainees had gathered, their voices low, no longer mocking, no longer dismissive, but uncertain, questioning. "Do you think she was some kind of champion?" one asked, and another shook his head slightly. "It did not feel like that," he said. "It felt like she was beyond needing to be one." And though the words were incomplete, the sentiment was clear, because what they had witnessed did not fit into titles or ranks. It existed outside of them. Ryan turned back, toward the center of the mat, his posture straightening slightly, but not in the same way as before. There was no tension in it, no need to assert anything, only a quiet alignment that mirrored, in some small way, what he had seen. And as he demonstrated a simple movement to a nearby trainee, his tone was different, slower, more deliberate. "Do not rush," he said, guiding the adjustment with care. "Do not try to win the moment. Understand it." And the trainee nodded, his expression more serious than before, absorbing the instruction in a way he had not earlier. The gym continued like this for a while, each movement carrying a little more intention, each interaction a little more aware, and though no one spoke her name again, Evelyn's presence lingered in every corner of the room, not as a memory, but as a shift in perspective that could not be undone. Outside, the sky had deepened into the soft hues of early evening, and the glow of streetlights began to reflect faintly against the glass windows, casting long shadows across the mat that stretched and shifted with every step taken inside. Ryan paused near the edge of the training area, his gaze lifting toward the reflection in the glass, catching a glimpse of himself not as he had seen before, but as he was now, stripped of assumption, grounded in something quieter, something more real. And in that reflection, there was a brief moment of stillness, a recognition that the lesson had not been about skill or strength, but about perception, about the space between what is seen and what is understood. Behind him, the sounds of training continued, steady, focused, different, and as the night settled in around the building, Iron Forge Gym carried on, but no longer as it had before, because sometimes one moment is enough to change the way everything else is seen, leaving behind a silence beneath the noise that never truly disappears. By the time the last training session of the evening began to wind down, something in Iron Forge Gym had settled into a new kind of rhythm, not louder, not more intense, but more deliberate, as if every person in the room had become just a little more aware of what they were doing and why. Ryan stood near the center once more, guiding a pair of trainees through a simple drill, but his voice carried a different weight now, no longer sharp with authority, but steady with intention. "Slow it down," he said, adjusting one of their stances with a light touch. "Do not rush to finish. Understand where you are before you move." And the trainee nodded, repeating the motion with greater care, his focus deeper than it had been earlier that day. Across the mat, the older man gathered his things quietly, pausing for a moment before heading toward the exit, his eyes scanning the room one last time, not searching, but acknowledging, as if confirming that the shift he had witnessed was real and would last beyond this evening. As he passed Ryan, he stopped briefly, offering a small nod. "Not everyone gets a moment like that," he said, his voice calm, reflective. "Most people train for years and never see it." Ryan met his gaze, understanding settling into place. "I almost missed it," he admitted, and the man gave a faint smile. "That is the point," he replied, before continuing on, leaving behind a thought that lingered long after he was gone. The gym gradually emptied, the sounds of movement fading into quieter echoes, the bright overhead lights dimming slightly as the last few trainees finished up, gathering their bags and heading toward the door with a different kind of silence than they had arrived with. Not tired, not distracted, but thoughtful. Ryan remained for a while longer, standing alone near the mat where everything had unfolded, his eyes tracing the faint marks left by countless hours of training, and among them, the invisible imprint of a moment that had changed something deeper than technique. He stepped forward slowly, placing his foot where Evelyn had stood, not out of sentiment, but out of curiosity, as if trying to understand what had made that space different, what had allowed her to move the way she did. And for a brief second, he closed his eyes, not in meditation, not in ritual, but in recognition, acknowledging that what he had seen was not something that could be copied, only understood over time. Outside, the night had fully settled, the streetlights casting a steady glow across the sidewalk, and somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of passing cars blended into the quiet of the evening. Ryan opened his eyes again, exhaling slowly, his posture no longer carrying the same weight of expectation it once had, because something had shifted, not just in how he saw others, but in how he saw himself within the space he had built. He reached for the lights, pausing for a moment before turning them off, his gaze drifting once more toward the door, not expecting anything, not waiting, just acknowledging what had passed through it. And as the room fell into darkness, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, carrying the echo of a lesson that had arrived without force, without noise,